Hello, I'm David Wallinga, Director of Healthy Food Action. Welcome to our new 4-part webinar series called Meat Matters, Meat, Livestock, and Human Health. This is also the kickoff of a series 2 to introduce you to the authors of books that are driving the thought and conversation around healthy food systems. We're pleased today to have Chris Leonard, author of the sensational book Meat Racket. Welcome also if you're new to Healthy Food Action, a national network that empowers health professionals through education and advocacy to help bring about healthier, more sustainable food systems. Making sure the webinar runs smoothly today is Rachel Gruwell. Big thanks to Rebecca Klein, who helped us organize this series. I'm going to introduce our moderator today, who is Bob Martin, Director of the Food System Policy Program at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. Previously, Bob was Executive Director of the Pew Commission on Industrial Farm Animal Production, and then he worked later for Pew Charitable Trusts. Bob, take it away.
I wanted to first thank our sponsors today. In addition to Healthy Food Action, sponsors include the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments and the American Holistic Medical Association, as well as the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, where I am located. After our 2 speakers finish, we should have at least 25 minutes of questions and answers. Please don't wait to submit questions. The earlier you submit your question, the better. On the right-hand screen menu, look for the box that says Enter Question for Staff. Type it and hit Send. Our first presenter today is Christopher Leonard. Chris is the former national agribusiness reporter for the Associated Press. His work has appeared in Fortune, Bloomberg Businessweek, Slate, The New Republic, and the New York Times. He is a Schmidt Family Foundation Fellow with the New America Foundation, a nonpartisan public policy institute located in Washington, D.C. And as David said, he is the author of the recently published book, Meat Racket, which is an excellent overview of the concentration in the meat industry. After Chris, we will hear from Dr. Michael Greger, the physician host of Nutrition Facts website, as well as the head of Agriculture and Public Health at the Humane Society of the United States. Dr. Greger is a founding member of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, a physician, author, and internationally recognized speaker on nutrition, food safety, and public health issues. He has also lectured at the Conference on World Affairs, testified before Congress, and was invited as an expert witness in the defense of Oprah Winfrey in the infamous meat defamation trial in Texas. He is a graduate of Cornell University School of Agriculture and Tufts University School of Medicine, and I would highly recommend one of the books of his that I've read called Bird Flu. So with that, Chris and Michael.
Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it. This is Chris Leonard, author of The Meat Racket, and I'm very happy to be here today to talk about this. I think what might be helpful to this audience about my book is sort of the overview that what my book is about is the business structure of the meat industry today. I profile the biggest meat producer in the United States, Tyson Foods, and I use that as a way to talk about where our meat industry is today, how the business operates, how it got to where it is today, and what that means for us as consumers, for farmers who raise this meat, and also, of course, for the quality of the actual meat we eat and the industry practices that produce it today. So I think that this can kind of help people perhaps understand the business model behind this, the business incentives behind it, and kind of an understanding of how the money drives the shape of the industry today. So to kind of start with an overview, I think one of the biggest headlines of my book, if you will, is that the industry is highly consolidated. In other words, very few companies have control over the market. In fact, the meat industry today is more consolidated than it has been at any point in U.S. history. including a period 100 years ago when the so-called meat trust really dominated the industry and prompted some of our nation's first and strongest antitrust laws. As you can see in this slide, just 4 companies control about 85% of our market for beef and cattle. Again, the highest level of concentration we've seen. In the chicken market, just 2 companies, Tyson Foods and Pilgrim's Pride, control almost half of the entire national market for chicken, a level of concentration that was unthinkable even 20 or 30 years ago. In the pork market, we see a similar kind of concentration with the top 4 firms controlling about 65% of the market. So on its own, you might wonder, well, who cares? I mean, concentration isn't necessarily bad. For example, Apple dominates the iPad market, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But history has shown us that when just a few companies get this much control over a marketplace, it can have very negative consequences for people that produce things and consume things. In this case, it would be the producers who are farmers and the consumers who would be anybody who eats meat. So my next chart is a scientific slide that shows the negative effects that can happen when you have massive industry consolidation. You can see it here, the effects. Of course, I'm joking. This is a cartoon from about 100 years ago, back when we had these really large companies like Standard Oil or the meat companies like Armour and Swift that had massive market concentration. And at that time, such a market created a lot of public resistance, as shown in this kind of cartoon. You've probably heard about Teddy Roosevelt and the trust-busting era. That was a response to these firms' market control, which also gave them tremendous power in Washington. You can see the tentacles of this octopus crushing the Capitol. What we saw back in the day was that when these firms got so much money, they used it to rewrite our federal laws in their interest, to control politicians who tried to reform the system. That's exactly what we're seeing today, to a very high degree. So I think what could be useful for this audience is to talk about what farming is like and what meat production is like in this kind of system, in this kind of highly concentrated, consolidated, and industrialized system. What does farming look like? Well, it looks a lot like this, okay? This is a modern-day chicken farm. And your typical chicken farm might have, 6 or 7 giant, sophisticated barns like this, full of maybe as many as 25,000 birds at a time. You're going to have automatic feeding lines, watering lines. We're talking large-scale operation. The beginning of my book really starts on farms like this. For me, that's where this whole inquiry began, because as a business reporter, I was going out to these farms and looking at them, really fascinated by this sort of scale of animal production. But what struck me was how little power the farmers have in an industry like this. This kind of facility we're looking at is going to be run by a quote-unquote contract farmer. What that means is it's a farmer who's borrowed as much as maybe $2 million to build a factory farm like this. But in this scenario, the farmer will never own the animals. Those chickens on the ground are going to be owned by a company like Tyson Foods. That means those chickens are never going to bump up against an open market. Tyson Foods owns them from egg to McNugget. And the farmer is going to have very little control over the means of production. What kind of drugs are given to the animals, what kind of additives are in their feed, what the animal feeds, how large they grow. All that is controlled by Tyson or a company like Tyson, and the farmer has very little leeway in how the animals are produced. So this is emblematic of a business model that is really at the heart of our industrialized meat system today. And that business model is called vertical integration. I know that's kind of a wonky term, but I think understanding vertical integration is very important to understand how animals are raised today and how our food is produced and why it's produced the way it is. So this slide shows the traditional farming economic model. In the middle there, that's supposed to be a little skyline of your typical downtown rural America, okay, a farming community. And in that community, you used to have all these independent businesses. Like up at the top, you'd have a hatchery where the birds were raised. You'd have independent farms. Over there, you'd have an independent feed mill that produced and sold food. You'd have a slaughterhouse that was independent. All these little businesses made kind of a constellation of economic activity in your typical small town that raised meat. That all changed in about the 1940s with the advent of vertically integrated chicken production. Now, in a vertically integrated system, everything we just talked about is owned, controlled, and orchestrated by one company, okay? A company like Tyson Foods or Pilgrim's Pride, they own the genetics of the bird, they own the hatchery, they own the feed mill, they own the slaughterhouse. They control and own everything. Now, this has been bad for rural communities, as you can imagine. You have fewer independent business owners. But it has also had a dramatic effect on how food is produced. For example, you can have a giant restaurant chain like McDonald's, and McDonald's can say, we have invented this incredible product called the Chicken McNugget. Then McDonald's can turn around to a company like Tyson and say, you produce the McNugget for us. Well, because Tyson is vertically integrated, it can tightly coordinate all these formerly independent sectors of rural America. I mean, Tyson can go to McDonald's and say, we will grow you the exact strain of bird you want to the exact weight, fed the exact thing you want, and processed into the exact product or the McNugget that you want. This model created tremendous industrial efficiencies, and it allowed the chicken industry to just explode in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and making it, in fact, America's most popular meat and America's cheapest meat. But that was really just the beginning. These firms, these vertically integrated chicken firms, looked out in rural America and saw that there was a lot of profit to be made elsewhere. For example, they started looking at the hog industry back in the 70s and 80s. Even as recently as the 1980s, most hogs in the United States were raised just as these animals appear in this picture. They ate outside. They lived in sheds that had outdoor access. A few companies said, you know what, I bet we could raise hogs the same way we raise chicken in these giant barns crammed in shoulder to shoulder. That was a hard thing to do. It took a lot of experimentation, a lot of new science, but eventually a few firms like Smithfield Foods and Tyson Foods, Premium Standard Farms, these companies cracked the code really around the 1980s, and they figured out how to raise hogs in essentially what were giant glorified chicken houses. You know, they had a few sort of what I'd call technological breakthroughs that allowed this to happen. The animals you see here are standing on slats, which let their manure fall into a pit below, which is collected in a lagoon. Antibiotics are very common to keep the animals from getting sick and passing on diseases to one another. Another key innovation is the so-called Gestation Crate you might have heard of, which allows you to pack a lot of hogs into one area and allows them to have piglets. And the Gestation Crate keeps the hogs from crushing the piglets or getting territorial and fighting one another. So these things were fundamental to creating the modern pork industry, which now looks almost exactly like the chicken industry. It's highly consolidated. It's vertically integrated. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, about 90% of all hog farms on the United States disappeared. The independent producer was replaced with a contract producer, and we see the effects of that today. And there are many health effects I think we're going to hear about later that come from this antibiotic use and this close crowding of animals. But the business model was tremendously successful for a small handful of companies like Smithfield Foods and Tyson Foods, which now dominate a majority of the market today. Cattle, we see a similar situation. Most cows today are actually raised, as you see here, on open ranch land, because these companies were never able to really crack the code on raising cattle in a concentrated barn the same way they did cattle and hogs. It just doesn't work for a variety of reasons. One of the key reasons being that calves must eat grass, and it's a lot more economical to put them out on a pasture. But the industry has consolidated the production at the very end of the cow's life. all cattle today, virtually all cattle today, are going to spend the last few months of their life on a feedlot like this, a highly concentrated, thousands of cattle in one location. And then these cattle are all sold to just 4 companies, Tyson Foods, JBS, Cargill being the 3 big ones, National Beef being the 4th. And what you see at this end is a sort of de facto vertical integration. These 4 big buyers now buy a majority of their cattle under a closed contract, and the giant feedlot owners are essentially turning into the same kind of role you saw with pork farmers and chicken farmers. They're raising animals in closed markets and under contract. So again, I've run through a lot of information here really quickly, but I'd like to summarize that what you see in animal production in this sort of consolidated and vertically integrated system are animals that are raised in confinement and in close quarters and at an industrial scale. The small hog farm has been replaced by the factory hog farm. Chicken coops have been replaced by enormous chicken barns. Cattle spend the last few months of their lives on feedlots. This is why you see a lot of the deleterious effects you hear about in the news. Overprescription of antibiotics, diseases that pass around on the farm, foodborne illness. Many of the foodborne illnesses you hear about start on the farm in those crowded chicken houses or crowded pork production facilities that we just talked about. And that's where a lot of this comes from. And further, the important point to remember here is that in a consolidated market like this, you have just a handful of companies that now control the livestock system down to the granular level. I mean, Tyson Foods can decide exactly how many chickens are born on a network of 1,000 farms. Smithfield Foods can decide exactly how many hogs are raised on the farms it controls. And then these firms have the ability to decide how the animals are raised. I'll just take one quick example. Over the last few years, a few cattle companies decided that they wanted their cattle to be fed with a growth drug called Zilmax, even though that drug was shown to create lower quality beef. Because just 4 companies decided to use Zilmax, it became the industry standard in a period of just a few years, even though most consumers had never heard about it. By the same token, the big poultry companies that dominate the market today decided that to be able to keep production so high in their slaughterhouses, they were going to use a chemical bath for their chickens, a chemical bath of sprays that had chlorine in them, or another chemical called peracetic acid. These chemicals have been shown to have bad health effects, not only for the workers in the plant, but anyone who accidentally eats, residual forms of these chemicals that might be on the bird. The use of these chemicals has become widespread, again, because when just 2 companies decide to do it, that means that half the market is now using that practice without consumers ever knowing anything about it. Furthermore, when you have an industry that is this consolidated, consumers don't have the ability to vote with their dollar at the marketplace. You and I can walk into a grocery store and see this rainbow of product brands in the grocery aisle, but really most of those brands are just produced by 4 companies. It is hard to exercise real choice in such a consolidated market. So for anyone who cares about this, you can obviously opt out quickly and buy your meat from the local farmer's market, right, and opt out of the system immediately. Not everybody has that option. So to address some of the problems that I found in my reporting, I think it's going to be necessary really to have a broad public policy approach to this. The same way we did 100 years ago when just a handful of companies controlled our meat market. That was fixed, if you will, through federal policy and a broad public policy approach, and I think that's what we would need to see again today. So with that, I will wrap up my presentation, and of course, happy and eager to take your questions and really appreciate the time. So thanks so much.
What are the public health implications of this mass consolidation and intensification of the meat industry, like these gestation crates, for example, used to house pregnant pigs? Practices that restrict natural motion, such as these gestation crates, induce high levels of stress in the animals and threaten their health, which in turn may threaten our health. This rise in stress hormone levels in these crated sows is thought to be because of interference with the expression of natural maternal behaviors like nest building. And this frustration of normal maternal behavior may result in impaired immunity. Measures as simple as providing straw bedding may decrease morbidity and mortality compared to these concrete slatted floors that Chris talked about, presumably by eliminating the immunosuppressive stress of lying on bare concrete their whole lives, which may also lead to increased infection risk. This minimal act, providing straw, has been shown to decrease the risk of swine flu. For anyone whose German may be rusty, Table 2 risk factors significantly associated with influenza virus infection. Compared to straw bedding, these bare slatted floors, 2.5 times the infection risk. Yet we often deny them even this kind of modicum of mercy, to their detriment and potentially to ours as well. The National Pork Producers Council defends this practice of immobilizing animals in cages so small they can't even turn around, saying, so our animals can't turn around for a couple of years. I don't know who asked the sow if she wanted to turn around. But the good news is that this practice is so out of step with just basic American values of decency towards animals that laws to ban gestation crates have been passed in 9 states so far. Swine flu killed 12,000 Americans, including 1,000 children, but that's a tiny fraction of the 60 million it infected. There's a bird flu virus out there now, H5N1, that has killed 60% of the people it's infected. That's worse than the fatality rate of the current Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Imagine if the easily transmissible swine flu virus combined with the deadly bird flu virus. That's really our biggest fear. Imagine 60 million Americans being infected with a virus that doesn't kill 1 in 5,000, but rather kills 1 in 2. What can we do? Well, the United Nations has urged that governments, local authorities, and national agencies need to take a greatly increased role in combating the role of factory farming, which, combined with these live bird markets, provides ideal conditions for the flu virus to spread and mutate into a more dangerous form. Factory farms can be thought of as incubators for the original emergence of dangerous strains of the flu. And then once a new virus emerges, these factory farms, these CAFOs, these confined animal feeding operations can act as amplifiers of influenza in the community. No wonder that the American Public Health Association, the largest and oldest association of public health professionals in the world, has called for a moratorium on these CAFOs. The Journal of the American Public Health Association published an editorial calling for a de-intensification of the pork and poultry industries. It's curious that changing the way humans treat animals is largely off the radar as a significant preventive measure. Such a change, if sufficiently adopted or imposed, could still reduce the chances of the much-feared influenza epidemic. It would be even more likely to prevent unknown future diseases that, in the absence of this change, may result from farming animals intensively. Yet, humanity doesn't even consider this option. We don't tend to shore up the levees until after disaster strikes. The editorial concludes that we could be threatening the well-being of future generations. It's time for humans to remove their heads from the sand and recognize the risk to themselves that can arise from their maltreatment of other species. How we treat animals can have global public health implications. But the good news is that the ASPCA has launched a major campaign to reform the way chickens are raised for meat. Learn more at truthaboutchickens.org. Most chickens raised for eggs are confined in battery cages their whole lives. What does that mean for public health? After testing 30,000 samples from more than 5,000 major egg operations across 24 countries for salmonella, this is what they found. Compared to caged hens, there's 43% lower odds of salmonella contamination in cage-free egg production, 98% lower odds of finding salmonella on free-range farms, and 95% lower odds in organic egg production. So the elimination of cages would be expected to dramatically lower the risk of salmonella infection, which currently sickens over 100,000 Americans every year, 142,000 cases of food poisoning. There's an egg-borne epidemic every year from salmonella-contaminated eggs. But the good news is that in about 100 days from today, January 1st, these barren battery cages are going to be banned in California. In a recent keynote address, the Director General of the World Health Organization warned that we may be facing a future in which many of our miracle drugs no longer work. A post-antibiotic era means, in effect, an end to modern medicine as we know it, she said. Things as common as strep throat or a child's scratched knee could once again kill. The Director General's prescription to avoid this catastrophe included a global call to restrict the use of antibiotics in food production to therapeutic purposes. In other words, use antibiotics in agriculture only to treat sick animals. In the United States, meat producers feed literally millions of pounds of antibiotics to farm animals who aren't sick just to promote growth or prevent disease in the often cramped, stressful, unhygienic conditions in industrial animal agriculture. The FDA estimates about 80% of antimicrobial drugs sold in the U.S. every year now go to the meat industry. Each animal feeding on an antibiotic can become a factory for the production and subsequent dispersion of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, a whole new meaning to the term factory farm. Antibiotic-resistant superbugs can then be blown out by ventilation fans into the environment. They can travel home with workers, as we learned in a paper published last week, or it may find its way into the supermarket. Now, in December 2013, the FDA released guidance for industry, their voluntary guidance for industry. They recommended antibiotics no longer be used just to fatten animals for slaughter, but emphasized that they are just that, toothless, non-legally enforceable suggestions. This voluntary approach has come under withering criticism from the public health and medical communities. But the good news is, last week, our third largest chicken producer announced that they're going to drastically cut antibiotic use in response to consumer pressure. Factory farms represent an efficient method of production, but may not be worth the risk. And the chief benefit, cheap meat, is in fact contributing to this slow-motion disaster of chronic disease the world is now facing. The World Health Organization blames the rapid increase in the consumption of animal-based foods, many of which produced under intensive methods, factory farms, which in conjunction with tobacco use threatens to undermine the health gains we've made in the developing world. Here's a graphic based on early swine flu mortality estimates. Even if you add up all the communicable disease deaths there in the middle, combined, they don't match one single chronic disease, heart disease, which can not only be prevented, stopped, but reversed with a more plant-based diet. But thanks to the mass consolidation and intensification, we can now get, McChickens on the dollar menu. But the good news is, last year, a nutritional update for physicians was published in the official journal of Kaiser Permanente, the largest managed care organization in the U.S., which covers about 9 million people with about 15,000 physicians who were told that healthy eating may be best achieved with a plant-based diet, defined as a regimen that encourages whole plant-based foods, discourages meat, dairy, eggs, as well as refined and processed junk. Too often, physicians ignore the potential benefits of good nutrition and quickly prescribe medications instead of giving patients a chance to correct their disease through healthy eating and active living. Physicians should therefore consider recommending a plant-based diet to all their patients, especially those with high blood pressure, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or obesity. The paper ends with a familiar refrain: further research is needed. In this case, though, further research is needed to find ways to make plant-based diets the new normal. For more on nutrition, check out my website, nutritionfacts.org. For more on infectious disease, you can read my book, Bird Flu, now online free at birdflubook.org. And for the underlying science, my critical reviews and microbiology paper, which I'd be happy to send anyone. Please don't hesitate to contact me anytime for anything. I'm at MHG1, just the numeral 1 at cornell.edu. To recap, when we overcrowd thousands of animals to cramp, filthy football field-sized sheds, to lie snout to snout or beak to beak, top their own waste, it can become a breeding ground for disease. But the good news is we have great organizations and institutions like Healthy Food Action and the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. Back to you, Bob.
Well, thank you, speakers, for a couple of great talks. This is Rachel, and Bob will be popping up soon with the first question for our presenters. I just want to thank you for your great talks. I've been collecting questions from the audience as you've been speaking, and we will now turn to those questions. Speakers, there are quite a few questions, so please be aware of your time as you respond. And Bob, I want to give you a chance to ask the first question if you've got one ready to go.
Yes, I sure do, Rachel, and thank you both for those excellent presentations. I think it highlights two of the most serious aspects of the industrial food animal system. The system is so large and so complex. I wonder if Chris and Michael, you could both address what needs to be done, or maybe what the barriers are to reversing or unraveling the concentration in the industry, and Michael, addressing the most serious public health threats by the industrial system.
Well, I guess, Michael, I'll just start really quickly by saying, from a business perspective, you know, I didn't start my book thinking this, but I really think, based on the reporting and the picture of the industry today, the market itself is unable to correct these problems of consolidation. That's what happens when you have too much monopoly power. We've seen this before in the United States, particularly 100 years ago in the era of the Great Trusts. What is needed, in my opinion, to address this consolidation is some sort of federal antitrust action. That's the tool we've used before. I have yet to hear of a better tool. And again, antitrust laws are meant to inject competition and transparency in markets at a time when the market itself has become unable to correct the monopoly problem. And that's the position where I think we are today. Short of that, you can have all the wonderful niche producers and entrepreneurs you want, but when a few companies have a stranglehold over the market, they can't really get the toehold they would need to reach the national market. So that's been my take on it, based on, you know, reporting on this for several years.
And I think one thing we can learn from this Purdue decision just this month is that despite the level of consolidation, you know, consumer pressure can still move these big producers. Now, being the third largest poultry producer, as you heard from Chris, is really not much. They only control about 5% of the chicken production in the U.S. But, you know, maybe they see this as a way to kind of muscle forward and get some more market share. And when asked why they were getting rid of most of the antibiotics in their chicken production, they said they were responding to consumer pressure. And so I think we should use that as a good sign. And you know, there's a flip side to this mass consolidation, and that is, yes, just a few decisions by a few countries can change the entire landscape of kind of retail meat production for the worse, but also potentially for the better. You know, the fact that the genetics for most of the chickens on planet Earth is literally produced by just a handful of breeding corporations means that, you know, a few decisions could literally change the genetics in terms of improving disease resistance. You know, within 5 years, we could basically replace the global chicken stock with kind of hardier, you know, flu-resistant birds. And so, but of course, they're not going to do that if they don't have some kind of regulatory pressure or consumer pressure. And so, but this Purdue decision, I think, gives us a little hope that even the really big players can be moved by massive shifts in consumer preference.
Great question and great responses. I have a few more questions from the audience. The first comes from Julia. The question, I think this pertains to, Chris, your slides. Using that cartoon as an example, how should policy be made not infringing on the right of an individual or company to pursue the free market without influencing policy to eliminate small farmers or the competition?
That's a great question. and I'm really trying to think about how to address it. Obviously, the problem today is I think the balance of power in terms of our policy is way over on the end of the 4 big meat producers that control the market. I mean, we have a host of laws and red tape that put independent farmers at a disadvantage. For example, our food safety inspection system now plays to the advantage of the few big companies that can run mega slaughterhouses, while putting independent farmers who might be raising actually healthy birds in a better environment at a disadvantage. I mean, I hate to say it, but you know, some of the key reforms that they passed 100 years ago, one of them had to do with campaign finance and trying to eliminate the special interest money from the basic day-to-day workings of Congress. When you do that, you can have politicians who are making sort of honest brokered decisions about policy instead of just trying to carry water for a few companies, which is exactly what we're seeing on Capitol Hill today in this industry. I mean, the American Meat Institute and the National Association of Meat are giant lobbyists that now skew our policy toward the few companies that dominate the market. Very simply, I would say we just need to push for pro-transparency, pro-competition kinds of policies that would help everybody from the small producer on up to the middle-sized producer.
Great, thanks, Chris. I've got a question here for Michael, and this comes from TT. Dr. Greger, can you please explain in more detail about meat methionine risks and restriction for health and cancer cells versus the absence in plants?
Oh, methionine.
Sorry.
That is a great nutrition question, and maybe a little too kind of specific for this general audience. But so there's essential amino acid found predominantly in animal foods called methionine that is cancer cells have what's called the methionine-dependent growth, meaning that with low levels of methionine, cancer cells don't grow as well. And so if you put the animals, for example, laboratory animals on low methionine diets, they live longer, get less cancer, et cetera. And I think that may be one of the benefits of caloric restriction. It's actually benefits of protein restriction, particularly the so-called high-quality proteins, like animal proteins. To keep methionine levels low may indeed slow the growth of cancer and extend human lifespan. So there's a lot of kind of theoretical work and good in vitro work, but not a lot of clinical work. But may explain why people who eat more plant-based diets have lower cancer rates overall, because they may be getting less methionine in their system, and by restricting methionine intake, basically just restricting one's intake of animal proteins, both meat, dairy, and egg protein.
Thank you. I apologize for not knowing the pronunciation of that. So this question, or there's 2 questions actually from our audience, from different audience members, about organic meat and more sustainable practices for raising meat, and kind of what role that plays in this whole story, and both, you know, on a policy level and more on like a practical health level.
Well, if I could jump in, sorry to keep doing that, Michael, but I mean,
No.
The way I see it, first of all, if you are troubled by the industrial meat system we're talking about, you do have an instantaneous opt-out method. I mean, I've seen a very vibrant, growing entrepreneurial market for organic meat. You're typically going to get this at a local farmer's market. It's increasingly being sold online. There are lots of ways to find it in your local community. And if you've got the time and a little bit of extra money to invest in it, it is a great way to quickly opt out. And of course, organic isn't a panacea. You can have foodborne illness, you can have problems, but I think one of the great advantages is the transparency and connection you can have with your producer. You literally can ask any question you want. You can look your producer in the eye and get a much better idea of how your meat is being produced. From the big scale picture, however, I would like to point out that this great, thriving entrepreneurial market is a tiny percentage of our overall food system. I mean, the vast majority of the meat we consume in America is produced by this consolidated industrial system we're talking about. So again, this is why I keep coming back to the necessity for a broad public policy approach to this problem, because it really does matter how our food is produced that we eat through cafeterias, through restaurants, through grocery stores. That matters a lot, and unfortunately that can't be solved alone, I think, by opting into this organic market. That's sort of my thought.
And I would agree with that. I think it's important to make the, make these critical policy decisions. It's, because the impacts of these farms go well beyond the consumers of those products in terms of the environmental implications. And when people get, E. coli eating spinach that was fed with, from manure runoff from a factory farm. Spinach don't have intestines, so they don't have intestinal bugs like E. coli. These are fecal pathogens. And so, someone who doesn't eat the factory farm meat could still be sickened by them, both from kind of environmental contamination, occupational problems, et cetera. And there's a lot of externalities that are very expensive for our country, both in lives and in dollars. And so it really is, so we're all impacted by this system. And so it's not enough for us to each in our own home do our own bit. Yes, we should put in our low-energy light bulbs, but we also have to have policy change for climate change, and the same thing can be said for improving our food system on the whole.
Great, thank you. That question actually plays into a couple more questions from our audience, specifically about the opportunity here to talk about a plant-based diet or a vegetarian diet, and whether or not that option of opting out of eating meat altogether is really maybe should be the focus of our energies, as opposed to genetic modification or trying to make some of these policy changes for industrial meat practices.
Well, from my perspective, this is Michael. It's it's not all or nothing. Even steps towards reducing meat consumption, like the Meatless Mondays program, have been phenomenally successful and taken up by entire public school districts like LA County. To just in hopes of reducing saturated fat intake by 15% or something if one goes a day enjoying meat-free meals. So there's a whole spectrum of both kind of the 3 R's. There's replacement of animal foods with plant-based foods. There's refinements. We can choose organic meats, healthier. Definitely a step forward in terms of food safety, public health, and animal treatment. And reduce the kind of 3rd R, is that we can choose bean burrito over beef burrito, et cetera, and make these small or large changes. And so I think we kind of it's a big tent, and we need all comers to affect the problems with how food's produced in this country.
Great, thank you. Chris, did you want to speak to that at all?
I would. A lot of that makes sense to me. I am not vegetarian, and I don't advocate a vegetarian diet. I think meat has an important role to play in agriculture and diet. But there's, we eat so much more meat today, in part because of the incredible production gains in this industrial system. There is no inherent reason why meat needs to be at the center of the plate for every meal. And these things like Meatless Mondays can help put meat back into the place in our diet that I think it's served for a long time, which is not the main central staple part of our plate, and that's going to be good for people's health. It's such a touchy issue, especially for me, I'm from the Midwest. A lot of the people I write about are in this meat business, and I think the fact is meat is going to be with us for a long time, especially in the United States. So to the degree you can create these sort of incremental changes Michael's talking about, I think that can be very good for people's health, for the environment, and all these things we're talking about, and then also work to shift the meat industry itself in a different direction. Great.
This is another question for you, Chris. How has consolidation of the meat industry affected reporting and the public's access to information about industry practices? Have you encountered any roadblocks? That comes from Ted Genoese.
That's a great question. Ted's a great reporter who's done incredible reporting on the meat industry, I have to point out, and some of the things going on at slaughterhouses in terms of ramping up production. I think this consolidation's been awful, just simply awful, even from an industry standpoint, in terms of consumers knowing how the meat is produced. The farms have become very, very, very opaque, very removed from the consumer. And, I think even from an industry standpoint, that's a horrible thing, with the pink slime story being a prime example of an industry practice that became widespread, that came into the public eye, horrified people, created horrible industry reverberations that maybe weren't even necessary. And so in that way, there is a deep, deep gap in understanding between how meat is produced and the consumer who actually eats it. But then I think it's very important to point out that these companies are throwing up huge roadblocks to stop the public from knowing how meat is produced. We've heard about these so-called ag-gag laws, which make it, or try to make it, an actual crime to simply videotape in factory farms. I just think laws like that, not only are they blatantly unconstitutional, but they're an awful idea, even from an industry standpoint. You can't be on the side of opacity in a world like this. You can't be on the side of trying to fight disclosure and public knowledge. I think the industry really needs to push more on being transparent and open, and consumers should also take a greater role in trying to learn more about how the meat is produced so that we're all on the same page.
Great response. So here's another question kind of about how we tackle this issue, and this is from Michael Wild. Who and what are the major lobbying groups and other organizations supporting this type of industrial consolidated farming, and how do we debunk the information that we're getting from that side?
Well, Michael, you're in the middle of this sort of information campaign all the time, so I'll let you answer that. I would just quickly say the main groups are the American Meat Institute, the National Chicken Council, the National Cattlemen's and Beef Association. And Michael, am I missing any, and how do you counter their narrative?
Well, one big lobbying force is the pharmaceutical industry. So the Animal Health Institute. I think it's really, using the antibiotics issue, really is a great illustrator of the power here within the Beltway of D.C., the influence of these large industry groups. So in this case, we not only have agribusiness, but also the pharmaceutical industry, so two that sell these drugs. And so we have two of the most powerful lobbyists, which can help explain why there's this kind of consensus in the public health community that this is a dangerous practice, feeding, this injudicious feeding of antibiotics in the feed to healthy animals just to fatten them up faster for slaughter, that this is a dangerous practice, yet it continues. How could there be such a, such a disconnect? And if you look at the sides of the debate, in one corner, you have the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, American Public Health Association, and 100 other medical and public health groups. Every single human medical or public health group in the country, essentially, has come out saying this is a dangerous practice. This feeding of antibiotics to fatten animals for slaughter. Now, and on the other side of the debate, who's actually for it? It's the National Turkey Federation, National Chicken Council, the Sheep Industry Association, National Pork Producers, right? So the contrast could not be more stark. I mean, the only reason there continues to be a debate is that the public health community is up against not just one, but two of the most powerful lobbies. And so the way it's going to stop is, this continued pressure from the public health community we don't need bodies in the streets before these changes need to take place. Antibiotic resistance is a serious growing threat. There's certainly things within the medical community we need to do to decrease overprescription of antibiotics, but the bulk of the antimicrobials sold in the U.S. are not going to to treat people, but just given to healthy animals to kind of as a pharmacological crutch to continue to allow the industry to raise animals under these kind of conditions. It's something that has been done away with in large part throughout Europe, and will hopefully the same thing will happen here with enough continued pressure. There's a bill that continues to come up called PAMTA, the Preservation of Antibiotics for Medical Treatment Act, which would restrict this kind of injudicious use, these non-therapeutic uses of antibiotics. And year after year, it gets shot down, but that's the kind of legislative solution that would be needed for, to preserve these miracle drugs for the future.
Great. Thank you. I have a question from Cecilia Shorty, and she's asking, why is healthier always so much more expensive? Where does the actual high cost originate that's passed on to the consumer?
Well, if I could say, I guess I don't mean to be glib. The reason it's more expensive is because the industrial process is so much cheaper, and it's all about economies of scale. It's just simply cheaper to raise 25,000 birds in one giant facility than it is to raise the same number of birds scattered on smaller facilities with different owners. It's just an economy of scale, and the same is true for hogs. And it's just, I think, the fact that, well, first of all, to back up, I mean, that's why we saw meat prices drop when adjusted for inflation, like through the 70s and 80s. They industrialized this system. But the problem is we're seeing the negative health consequences of that system, as we've been talking about. So it's not like these organic farmers are feeding animals some extravagant, wild, expensive feed, or that they're charging hyperinflated prices to get a lot more money. I think it's just the fact that when you do something on an industrial scale, whether it's making cars or whether it's making chickens, you're going to get some savings, and that's what's going to make it cheaper. But as we talk about again and again, there are costs to that, and these companies have been able to push those costs off their balance sheet. For example, the price of pollution and manure from the hog farms is a cost that often gets borne by the public, whether it's in terms of polluted air or polluted water when these lagoons break. So I guess that's my short answer, is just that healthier meat is not going to typically, well, healthier meat is not going to be done on this sort of giant industrial scale, and that's going to make it slightly more expensive, but not necessarily prohibitively more expensive, I would think.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've got quite a few questions just basically on how do we educate our consumers and our patients about the food system so they can advocate for themselves. Is there a way to change labels to inform consumers of this type of risk? And just how do we bring awareness to some of these issues?
That's really the important question. How we do that is we have these kind of wonderful consumer and public health coalitions that go out and do these large campaigns to educate. I mentioned the new ASPCA campaign on chickens. That's something that's been necessary for a long time. And people just don't know. I mean, I'm glad Chris brought up the ag-gag laws, these kind of anti-whistleblower laws. It shows that, I mean, that's how the disconnect between how people think meat is produced, still with this kind of old McDonald's farm impression, and how it's actually produced. The industry knows that that disconnect is so wide that if people actually found out what was going on, like, they don't need to be taught, it's not a philosophical argument that, we really need to treat animals better, or we really need to have, I mean, people, all they have to do, you show them a picture of it, and people realize, you don't need an animal scientist or behavioral, biologist. I mean, it's wrong. Wrong and risky, the way that we're raising animals. So all that we need to do is really just tell people, just show people how this is going on. The ag-gag laws really speak to the industry's fear that if people knew what was going on, things would change. And in fact, there's a slide I use in presentations from a leading animal science textbook that's used in college animal science classes, which with the author of the textbook is saying the less the public knows about how meat is produced, the better. Like that's the, and they just understand that, it's gotten so far away from just kind of basic kind of standards of kind of decency and common sense, that our role, I think, at this point is really to just let people know what's going on. And so for the Humane Society of the United States, we've done all these ballot initiatives, and it's really just a matter of showing footage of what's going on, and that's why these ag-gag logs are so important for industry, because literally just seeing images of what they're doing is enough to get consumers to drop their forks and drop different ballots. So at this point, I think it's really education, and kind of we already have the public on our side. It's just a matter of letting them in on industry practices.
I would just quickly agree with that and add that I started writing about industrial ag back in 1999 as a reporter at a small newspaper, and the public landscape has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. People are very open to this message now. There are a lot more resources out there that you can turn people to. They can get stuff Googling it very, very quickly, whether it's from Pew Charitable Trust reports or the movie Food Inc., or I'm sorry, I have to say the book The Meat Racket, or bird flu. I mean, there are just so many more resources out there, and I think people are primed to hear this. So the bar for educating people is lower than I think it was even 10 years ago.
Well, I'd like to thank all those people who sent questions in to our panelists, and to thank the presenters again for two excellent presentations and the very thoughtful response to the questions that were presented.
Thanks a lot.
So happy to be here.
Great. David, do you want to talk about the future of the Meat Matters webinar series?
Yes. Our next Meat Matters webinar is with Ted Genoese, author of the not yet released book called Chain, Farm, Factory, and the State of Our Food. We're very excited about that one as well. That's going to be October 23rd, the day before Food Day, which is the theme of which this year is something we didn't touch on today, which is food justice. And speaking of food justice, we actually have a different webinar series next week. That's our series on food justice and health equity. And we're going to be having a webinar on food sovereignty with representatives talking about food systems in many First Nations, Native American communities. So please join us for those. And that series is sponsored by the American Public Health Association, the National Black Nurses Association, and the National Medical Association. So if you're not registered, just go to our website for that. So let me just thank the panelists again, and thank you to the audience for joining us today. If you have colleagues that missed the timing of the webinar, just let them know that they can register and tune into the rebroadcast. And that should be up within, I think, a day or two. So thank you.